This podcast is brought to you by the Association for Coaching, one of the world's leading international professional bodies, which is advancing coaching in business and society worldwide. My name is Kate Jenkinson, and I am your host for this wonderful 8-part series, Neurodiversity in the Workplace, where, along with my guests, we explore the rapidly developing landscape that is neurodiversity in work. My guests are industry leaders, coaches, and business founders who share their passion, knowledge, and the real-life situations and scenarios from their own practical lived experience. Together, we examine the complexity of the workplace for those who experience the world differently. Whether you're a business owner, leader, coach, or trainer, these conversations highlight how you can make a difference to everyone's working world by looking at life through a neurodivergent lens. Well, I am delighted to have Ludmila Praslova, Professor of Organisational Psychology and the acclaimed author of the Canary Code, with me today. I'm so delighted to have you, Ludmila. You have experienced neurodiversity in organisations both from the inside and outside, researching for your book, haven't you?
Yes, and thank you so much for this kind introduction. I definitely do have quite a bit of experience personally and research-wise with how neurodivergent people experience workplace.
I think we have to start with the first question, which is somebody who's neurodivergent myself. I love the metaphor of the book and the name of the book, The Canary Code. So maybe you can just explain how you came up with the title and what that means.
Well, I've been thinking about it for a while. And when I started coming up with the model that when you create workplaces that work for the most sensitive and for people who have maybe the most obstacles for dealing with all the stressors that accumulate, it just kind of made sense that if you create environments that work for those who are more sensitive, that will work for everyone, which does align with the whole idea of canaries in coal mines, because the reason canaries were used in coal mines to detect carbon monoxide is not because canaries are broken or defective, but because that particular sensitivity is just a part of their makeup, because it allows them to do all the very important things, and their intensive air metabolism is what allows them to fly. But also because they metabolize air on exhale and inhale and just, much more intensely, they also are going to be first impacted by impurities in the air. So the same thing with neurodivergent people. We take in very often way more information. And that's all kinds of information, sensory information, as well as cognitive information. So when we are in environments that are toxic, then we're also processing more of the toxicity. Like a canary in a toxic mine is processing more of the toxicity and is going to impact the canary before it will impact the miners. The same way in the workplace, it's going to impact neurodivergent people or other people who are maybe experiencing variety of life's limitations that limit just how much more they can take. Then all of those additional stressors, bad management, poor work organization, all of those things are going to impact those more vulnerable first, but it doesn't mean that they are weak. It's going to impact other people eventually.
Yeah. And I think that's such an important metaphor, isn't it? It's like the early warning system for an organisational culture. It resonates strongly with me because I come from a mining community as well. So it has that connection in my mind. And also being a biologist, the fact that it's a strength to have that sensitivity.
Unless you're in a super toxic environment, yes.
This is true. This is true. It's how it's perceived as well, isn't it, by others? And so hence the name, the Canary Code, and your experience of those environments. I mean, you give some examples that are very personal as well, but can you tell us what inspired you personally to write this book?
Well, really most of my life, because as much as I've been in the workplace, and I've been working since I was 14, and I've been in all kinds of environments, from the factory to academia to boardrooms, I could never figure out why can't we pay attention to one dimension of difference, but not to all of them. So I worked in global diversity, and everyone was so aware of culture, but they didn't think about gender. Or everybody will go in on gender, but nobody remembers disability. And just the lack of intersectional approach in diversity, it bothered me my entire career. And I was trying to solve it and try to help organizations create environments that really work for all kinds of humans. So a lot of it was my personal experience, because I had to invent this word unincludable, because when they would do a gender programs usually don't work for autistic women, because they basically teach you how to elbow other women out of the way. And that's not helpful. There are too many different dimensions to us, and the lack of intersectional approach was something that I've been trying to solve. And this model is really kind of the answer to this feeling of being unincludable, because there are so many dimensions of difference. So like being a first generation academic, and all of those things matter. And when people just say, okay, so we're just going to do a program based on whatever, XYZ, it just doesn't do the trick for people who are different on multiple dimensions.
So first of all, I have to commend you for inventing a word where one didn't exist. As a fellow wordsmith, I really appreciate that. One of the words I invented was to tangibilize things. And I think this is what you've done.
Yeah.
You've tangibilized that toxic environment, or the potential for the environment to be toxic if we don't pay attention to all these different areas.
I love tangibilize.
Do you like that word?
Yeah. It makes perfect sense. We need that.
Yeah, we do. Why do you think people focus just on one or two areas of inclusion? You mentioned that people do that. Why do you think that's what they do?
I always thought that it was just our cognitive limitation, that we can only keep so much in our mind, which we do. We can only keep so many variables. And we could think like white women, black women, young women, old women. But somehow when it's more than two things, we just can't. So if we start thinking about, a young neurodivergent, disabled first generation, we're like, leave me alone. So that was one theory. But then I was in one conference with all the big name companies, and I just asked them, why don't you pay more attention to disability? And they basically said, other people scream louder.
Oh, really?
So I was like, okay. So they basically pay attention to whoever screams louder, and that's what they do. And I think that's how corporate minds work. So my generous explanation is that we have cognitive limitations, but there's also something that some companies actually acknowledge, that they just pay attention to whoever screams louder.
Wow. That's really interesting, because there's also this thing around, I've already gone down a side tangent that I'm really interested in workplaces, having worked on leadership teams and wondering myself why people first approaches weren't taken. One of the questions I used to ask myself as a people leader was, who have I missed? And I feel that sometimes we don't ask the right kind of questions. In fact, we probably don't ask enough questions around this subject matter, do we?
We don't. And I don't think we want to, because I think the answers are going to inconvenience us, because we'll have to maybe do something about it. So I think many people just prefer to pretend that those differences don't exist, because if they think about them, they'll have to think about how to organize office for different kinds of people and how to organize schedules for different kinds of people. And it would make it very hard to pretend that we can just impose this one size fits all or one size fits none in reality model of working on people. So there's kind of like the willful not looking in that way.
Okay.
So it's not that they can't see it, but I think in many ways they're just trying not to, because they also have limited focus. I can be generous here, and people can pay attention to so many things, but it makes their lives easier because they're just not dealing with all those differences, even though it really wouldn't have been that hard if they just did it.
Yeah. It's really interesting because we've had a few other of our guests mention something along the lines of, until the reality is something you've personally experienced, it doesn't become something that has the impact until it's something you recognise in your family or close to you. Is that something you've noticed and seen?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, in neurodiversity, you always see people who say, well, yes, when they discovered something, let's say their kids, grandkids, nephews, and then all of a sudden they started paying attention. And it's not always the case. There are people who just tend to be more aware and they try to pay attention to differences and to groups they don't belong to. And there are disabled people who are promoting anti-disability policies.
Yeah. It works in all different ways, doesn't it?
Yeah, it works in all different ways, but generally it is human nature to pay more attention to things that we personally experience.
Yeah, that's true. There are so many things I like about the book. First of all, it's incredibly accessible. There are many different ways to consume it and appreciate it. I'm an Audible listener, and you have this kind of find your own adventure or something, I think you describe it as. So you can often find me dabbling around in the appendices. I like to go to the back of the book first. But the thing I really do like is you give those examples of where people are doing things right, where businesses are doing things that work. Can you give us one of your favourite examples of that?
Well, one of the examples I talk about is Ultranauts, because they really designed their entire work model for neurodivergent people from the start. So that allowed them to create many unique approaches that then a lot of other people later copied, but they were designed from the start for remote work, for flexibility, for people who want to work 25%, 50%, 75%, and in all the different ways. They have different ways for people to get feedback according to how their minds work. So that's really a lovely system. My other favorite example that I actually didn't talk about as much as I wanted to, literally because it just was running against publishing deadlines and one of the chapters didn't make it in. So I only have a brief mention of Lemon Tree. But okay. I love Lemon Tree. Well, first of all, they're not in tech, which is always nice. To have a company that's not a tech company in your diversity realm, but they've been doing it for quite a long time. And they just have so much for different kinds of people. And they started with hiring a couple of deaf people. Now they have those huge programs for all kinds of people and this very elaborate system, let's say, for people with Down syndrome, where they tailor jobs for what they can do and they have special work manuals that are developed for how they process information and different options and adjustments. So I think Lemon Tree, the Indian hotel chain, is an amazing example.
That's brilliant that you can get the opportunity to promote them on the podcast now then. I love to hear those success stories. I love to hear and learn from them. When you say they designed neuroinclusion or with a neurodivergent perspective in mind, who does that involve? Who's doing the designing?
Well, that's a good question. So I was mentioning Ultranauts. Their model is very interesting because even though the founders did not consider themselves neurodivergent, they did talk very closely to neurodivergent community, and they had just very high percentage of neurodivergent employees from the beginning. And they did have a lot of participation and a lot of dialogue. So even though the founders wanted it to be designed for neurodivergence, they actually did not just say, okay, I know what's going to work, but they did involve a lot of people who were making suggestions, and then they would continue iterating it with additional feedback.
Amazing. I think those two factors that you've just said there are fundamental to a culture that is people-oriented. The dialogue, because dialogue is to and fro, but it's not just one way. And then the feedback as well, the kind of what isn't working, what is working. What are some of those mechanisms that you've seen organisations use that maybe don't work so well in the feedback space for neurodivergent people?
Well, if there's only one way to get feedback, for example, a face-to-face meeting,
Yeah.
that sometimes people just don't feel it's private enough. Other people feel like they need more time to collect their thoughts. So if it's just, we're just going to do this one focus group a year, and that's your only opportunity, that's pretty hard because, again, you just have to elbow other people to get a word in. That's not super effective. But what's really not effective is just not paying attention or doing it, check the box, because for the most part, we all get those surveys and then people just don't pay attention to them, or they tell you, yeah, we got your survey, whatever. That's another thing that's sometimes happening. At least some of them will say that, as AT&T has recently done. But other companies, they just say, yeah, okay, disgruntled people, who cares? And then they just don't pay attention. So that's a problem when it's just a formality and then people figure that out. And why would I say anything?
And if you're only doing those kind of feedback surveys once a year, what I've noticed is that who shouts loudest is not necessarily a single person with a loud voice. It's the majority. And of course, what we're talking about here is inclusion of people who are not in the majority.
Exactly.
They're always the minority voice. And that's another principle that really struck me about your book. And I can't get it out of my head in a good way. Inclusion from the margins is another phrase that you use. Tell me a little bit more about where that's come from in your experience.
Well, that's a very interesting approach because sometimes, even with universal design, there are issues that people just think they know and they design for you, and it actually is not working. And many people in education know that universal design for learning does not do what it's promising to do in many cases. My favorite example is the toilets. Whoever named the universal height toilet didn't ask short people because they actually only work for tall people.
That's true. I mean, I'm not that short, but I do prefer, I shouldn't maybe say this on the podcast, but if there are children's toilets, I'll use them when they have designed them smaller. Yeah.
Because supposedly universal height toilet is horrible for children and short people.
And often when I go into the women's, this is going to become a toilet conversation. It always does at workplaces. Sometimes the mirrors are too high to even see yourself because they've been put in there by a tall person. Anyway.
So that's the issue with sometimes people think something is universal design, but it's not. So that's why I like design from the margin, because it's specifically looking for people for whom universal is not working.
Oh, that's so interesting.
And it comes from interventions with really poor communities.
Okay.
So someone will come up with an idea, or this is how we're going to, improve nutrition in poor communities. But they're too poor to take advantage of that program because they don't have transportation, or they don't have other means of communication, or they don't have whatever to even take advantage of those programs that are supposedly designed for them. So then you talk to them and then you actually design with what they suggest you to do from their experience. And so that would be designed from the margin, when you go to the most marginalized and find out how they actually live and what they actually need.
That's kind of turning things on its head in a beautiful way, I may add. I think it's a very lovely way to do it. And when you think about the actual effort from an organisational point of view, it actually means they're having less conversations, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It actually is a more time-efficient way of managing that sort of feedback and communication process, because you're speaking to fewer but more diverse people.
Yeah. And if you create something that really works for a really extreme cases on opposite sides, by definition is going to work for people in the middle. So you shouldn't ask people in the middle. You should, but they are usually the ones who get asked all the time.
And this happens. I will give an example, a personal example, which was a powerful reframe for me. But when we do these kind of word clouds and we ask people to give their feedback and we go for the biggest word and we often drill into that, that's the opposite, isn't it? We want to take the little tiny word that's at the edge of the word bubble and go, well, why has one person used that very different word to describe something? And we don't often do that. We've got this kind of the biggest word, the most hands.
The bell curve, whoever is in the middle wins.
Yeah, but I don't like bell curves either.
Well,
Not from the point of view of performance management.
oh no, breaking people in the curve is a horrible practice. It doesn't work.
So let's just go there then. Why doesn't that work? Why do bell curves not work for people?
Well, you mentioned the performance management.
Yeah.
And it's really funny because students always tell you, oh, can you just grade it on the curve? By which they think if they didn't do too well, but if you curve it, it's going to make them look actually better. But what actually happens in most workplaces, when you have this forced distribution, and it says that the certain percentage people are going to be on the top and certain percentage people have to be on the bottom. So let's say you have a very high-performing, well-selected group, and you're trying to impose that some of them are winners and some of them are losers. If you look at the objective criteria, they are all going to meet your criteria because they're all high-performing people.
Yes.
But you're going to impose the loser and we're going to cut you on some of them anyway. That doesn't make any sense. And you can also envision a group that's not very good, but some of them are going to be ranked as wonderful. So what it does, it just creates unnecessary stress because in a group of experienced engineers, usually nobody is incompetent. But what it does is that, well, we're just going to impose this curve review and some of you are going to be ranked as incompetent anyway. And
yes,
it creates very unhealthy environment. People start competing with each other because instead of looking at your objective absolute outcome, we start looking at something relative and we enlarge minuscule differences that are not meaningful. And then we put a bunch of bias into it because that's what we do. And that's what all of our AI systems do because they learn from us. And then we're just going to decide somebody's life based on it. People tried it. Companies tried it. Let's say Enron tried it. Do you want to use the model that Enron had for their performance evaluation? And people keep trying to revive this like zombie. It's scary.
I love that. Well, we're very clear that both of us find that normal distributions do not work for human performance.
No.
Everything you've said there, I've experienced in real life. And I'm happy to give my example of both being at the high end of a high performance normal distribution, depending on what strengths you look at. And then if you look at the weaker areas with a neurodivergent person, we've got these spiky profiles where either ends of that normal distribution, you could rank me as a poor performer. So basically, it doesn't matter whether I'm achieving the outcomes that are set or not. If you're judging how I do it, and that's what you're saying, I have to do it in a particular way, then yes, I'm going to be at one end or the other.
That's where you just need to look at outcomes and the absolute outcomes, not the relative outcomes to whatever moving target.
So now that we've just kind of reimagined the whole performance management process, which I'm all for, by the way, what are some of the good practices that are out there? You've talked about absolute outcomes. So what else do people do that works well?
So if you just have very clear rubrics and you don't move the target and people know what's expected of them, and if they will do X, they'll get fairly evaluated. That's a much better psychological approach. More proactive performance management rather than this big, scary once a year performance evaluation that even most managers hate doing because it's stressful for everyone involved.
Everybody hates doing an annual process.
And it doesn't make sense. Just, know how your people are doing and give them feedback when it matters. And just the regular feedback works much better than those big, scary things that just keep popping. It's really cyclical. So companies would eliminate those big, scary performance evaluation. And then the zeitgeist changes. And now they're like, yeah, we're going to get those employees and evaluate this and implement this really harsh performance system. Because 10 years ago, it worked so well that entire companies fell apart. But people just kind of forget and they're like, well, let's give this a try again because maybe human psychology changed.
It seems to be that those approaches do have an impact because there's this small uptick, isn't there, in performance when you put that level of pressure on people, but over a sustained time. It's the canaries in the coal mine that start to feel the pressure of it, and it doesn't work in sustain.
Fear doesn't work. Okay, so if you get a burst of stress hormones out of someone because they're running away from a bear, that's what you get, a very short burst, but then you're going to get the depleted people who are just like staring into space. And then people say, well, we're just going to get rid of them and bring in new people. And then, of course, everyone else is doing the same thing and burning people out. So where exactly are you going to find those new people?
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense for anybody.
No. So when we think about neuroinclusion from the margins, it can benefit everybody. And you talked a little bit about something which maybe we ought to explore some more about, job crafting or structuring. Now, that's really interesting because some organisations think, well, we have this fixed job, it's evaluated at this level, it attracts this remuneration. How can they craft a job to fit somebody and it be fair and inclusive?
Job crafting is just such an underappreciated way to have a win-win situation, because you mentioned spikes already. So everyone has this pattern of talent. So when you are operating those very specific machines that had very little adjustment, so you should be able, push that lever or whatever. Even there could be some adjustments. But networks are just so much more, for most of us, it's so much more flexible.
Yeah.
And there are many ways to do the same job. And there are also ways to say, if this is your talent and this is my talent, let's just trade some of the things. You do what you love, I do what I love. Everybody wins. The company gets better results because you're working with our strengths. So job crafting and creating something for individual, it always existed. All the good things always existed on higher levels because people would say, I'll do that, and then I'll just hire an assistant to do whatever. But it's really doesn't have to be limited there, because people can job craft as a team and then just say where they're going to put their talents. And it's absolutely possible to create something, whether in large or in small companies. It really depends on your creativity, where you could just improve the fit. You don't just try to squeeze someone round square pegs into round holes, but they'll just say, well, what exactly is this person's spiky profile and the best talent, and how we can use it best? And that's just something that tends to work so much better. And in most jobs, now, there's a lot of flexibility in how you can organize something to just find ways to allow people to job craft, because sometimes people will just proactively tell you, how about I'll take on this new example. Some people want to be very entrepreneurial within the organization, allowing them to do something, to create something that didn't exist in that organization before. And in many ways, it just tones down on people's way, because people want to be creative and they want their jobs to be meaningful. And if you don't put them in a box, they're going to deliver a lot of really incredible work.
It's really interesting how you talked about that as a team effort. And we've just been talking about performance management, which kind of breaks people down into individuals as opposed to teams. Definitely when I've worked in organisations that have been high performing, which is what everybody wants their organisation to be, it's ones which have had that team approach and team metrics and team outcomes, and then they've sort of self-organised to deliver, like you said. And so, in fact, we don't have to be as close to crafting and designing the job if we let the teams have some more of that autonomy, do we?
Absolutely. There's just so much potential that we're not tapping into. And then we try to put the screws in to get productivity by fear, but just allowing people to be creative works so much better.
I think we're on the same page with that one. But also the research and the evidence shows it, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
It shows us that performance increases when we've got neurodivergent people in teams. What's your experience of why that is, Ludmila?
Well, you just have a wider range of abilities. And again, some neurodivergent people can do tasks very effectively that other people struggle with. So you don't just bring in more of the same by adding neurodivergent people to the team. You bring in different pieces that create a much richer overall talent set. So you will create people who like things that nobody else likes doing. Either it's taking more risk than other people are comfortable with or being more detail-oriented than other people. So we just bring more of those strengths that are a little bit more on the rare side. And that just creates a much better rounded group overall. Because if you hire the same person over and over and over again, you're not bringing new teams. You're not bringing new skills.
There's something there, isn't it, about the hiring practices, hiring for culture fit. I love the phrase that Brené Brown evidences that fitting in is the opposite of belonging.
Mm-hmm.
So even eliminating the term culture fit would be something I guess we'd need to do.
Yes, it would be so much better if we just focus on core values and just let people be themselves in most ways.
But people are complex. We've said this. There's many different intersecting identities. So how do you think workplaces can be more intersectional in their approach? What is it they need to do?
Be more intersectional. The way to look at it is just really look at the human needs. Because if you start saying, okay, so what's disability? Well, there's all kinds of disabilities. Or what women need. A woman who has a young child who's lactating, it's very different things for a woman in a different stage of life. So you just need to think about what humans of all different kinds need. Think about it as not even a characteristic of a particular demographic, but just what is the full range of things that human needs. So humans need flexibility, right? And that could be because they're neurodivergent or because they have a young child or whatever. It doesn't matter. Caregiving or they're going to school. So humans need flexibility. And then you create different ways of flexibility. Humans need to be heard, and humans need to be heard in different ways. So create different avenues for input, including those where people can working from home, do something remotely, not just face to face. Different ways of accepting input because everyone communicates in different ways. Allow them, anything from voice to typing to any other format. And with technology, it's so much easier now. What else humans need? Well, humans usually want to be evaluated fairly. So create the system that's not based on particular bias that you have to be there all the time and you need to look a certain way, but just create something that's outcomes based. And if someone is doing well juggling whatever it is they're juggling in however way works for them and they're meeting those targets, why would you badger them about the rest of it? So trying to just think about all the different ways in which we're different and just saying, not everyone can come in person. Not everyone communicates verbally. Not everyone does whatever. And just providing as much flexibility as possible. Then you don't have to think about each particular person. Okay, did we forget about this aspect or that aspect? You need to check it. So when you're instituting a system, you want to check, will it work for this person with this limitation, with this difference, with those demands. But for the most part, if you create systems that are flexible, that maybe sometimes you may still need an exception or adjustment because someone has a very unique situation, but you're going to reduce the number of special adjustments by far because if it's already flexible, then people will just use flexibility for whatever reason they need.
I couldn't agree more. As you're talking through, I can pick up these are the sort of principles of the Canary Code, but there's one that really stands out to me that I'm curious to explore. When I worked in HR for a long time, and I think I was drawn to that profession because I wanted things to be done right. So this kind of justice sensitivity, this kind of fairness that really drives somebody who has a neurodivergent perspective. And yet sometimes things aren't perfect. So there is like a trade-off here sometimes, isn't there, between maybe a strength that I have and what's practical in an organization? Are there times we have to balance those out?
Well, if you think about fairness is not the same thing as having super rigid systems that are going to work for every situation. So there's one principle in organizational justice is that things are correctable. So you have this additional safety layer that sometimes managers make mistakes. So you need to have an additional check that would sometimes allow to reverse decisions that were made that were not fair. And that's actually one of the major characteristics of just systems in the workplaces. It doesn't mean that everything has to be checked with legal or so legalistic that nobody can breathe.
Yeah, no, we don't like those environments.
No. And that's really not what this is about. It's about actually listening from people, allowing everything due process, and allowing for whether it's an ombuds office or additional checks and balances so that nobody has this absolute power to do things, because we're just really not good when we have this absolute power. So there's this always additional checks in every system. That's really the mechanism for ensuring justice rather than regulating every minor thing about what humans do.
And that should be a relief for people, really, isn't it? If you've got a culture where you are open to the fact that mistakes can be made by anybody and that they can be corrected, we know that creates psychological safety, doesn't it? It's a really important element.
Even for decision makers, we don't want people to be sloppy, but we also don't want people to think that, I'm just this ultimate authority that is everything to everybody. And when we have the systems that are transparent enough and flexible enough and have enough checks and balances, that really does make everyone feel much more confidence in whatever is going on and much more psychological safety to say that something needs to be corrected, because the system actually does allow for correcting those mistakes.
It feels like it's quite a difficult balance to get right for maybe the middle managers, the line managers. They're in that no-win scenario sometimes. What hints and tips have you got for them if we've got people listening in that middle management position?
Again, listening takes you very far. And knowing people, sometimes people just really wants to be heard. Nobody expects you to act on everything they say every time. But being heard and saying, this is what I can do, and this is what I can't do, and this is why. Just fairness and transparency go very far. And if there are limitations, then you just explain limitations. And if there's something that's unknown, then just say, honestly, we don't know. So don't try to be perfect, because humans will work with other humans because they know how humanity works. So again, sometimes people just put too much perfection pressure on themselves, but that's not what we need from each other. What we need from each other is humanity, not perfection.
Oh, I just love that, Ludmila. That's really touched my heart, actually.
Well, thank you.
And because I've told you before, but some of your work has inspired my poetic reflection. In fact, the first poem in my poetry book had the heading inspired by the Canary Code, but I changed it to neurodelusion because it was like the negative aspects of organisations not understanding. They don't have to be perfect. They just have to listen. Exactly like you said. Powerful.
Thank you. I'm just so thrilled that we have people who write poetry about those things. I'm really amazed by your talent.
I think if there was something I would put out there into an organisation's manifesto, I would ask that when they are giving this diverse communication channels, that they do some in poetry as well as prose. I think that would then connect with both sides of the brain.
I love it. That would be amazing. I would go for it.
Yes, I know you would. I know you write poetry as well.
Yeah, organizational poetry. Why not? That sometimes will allow us to get some of the feedback that people won't give otherwise.
This is true. This is very true. I wanted to ask you, I may have asked this already, but maybe not directly, what inspired you personally? Because you're very open about being a neurodivergent individual yourself. So what were some of the personal drivers for you in writing this book? What changes did you want to see?
Well, I did not know I was neurodivergent until very late in life, or I knew I was different my entire time, but I didn't have a label until very, very late. That was a major discovery. Just understanding how being autistic is very different for women, for example, and how differently it manifests. That was just a huge light bulb. And that was actually the missing piece in my thinking about intersectionality, because when we start thinking about differences on the psychological level, that really opens it up, because big culture and, gender and social economic status, they all eventually manifest on the psychological level, how we think, how we feel, how we process information. So when we start thinking about psychological level differences, then we actually can effectively address those psychological level differences as coming from neurodivergence, but also psychological level differences that come from national level cultures, that come from, the gendered upbringing, whatever it is. So this psychological level of human difference is really, I think, a key to doing diversity right.
Yes, thank you for that. I'm late diagnosed as well, but like you say, a lot of people say that when that happens, it's like a penny drop moment. Suddenly things make sense. And I think it's easier then to advocate for when you're in a performance management situation or you're giving feedback, it's easier to advocate for things that you know you need now rather than trying to fit in or trying to do the work as it's suggested you do it.
Because you just keep feeling, what is wrong with me? But actually, there's a lot of things that are wrong, but not necessarily with you, but they might be wrong with your environment.
Yeah, exactly. It is about the environment. I always say to people, because I'm a biologist by training, that I love the metaphor of the flower. If the flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment, not the flower. I'm not a very good gardener myself, but that metaphor makes complete sense to me. I wanted to ask you about leadership and neuroinclusion. We've talked a little bit about individuals and the middle managers, but is there any advice you'd give to a leader who's maybe at an early stage of really understanding neurodiversity or redesigning or reaffirming the culture in a more neurodivergent friendly way? What can leaders do?
Okay, I would probably need a whole other hour to talk about leadership applicable to neurodivergence, but really briefly, if you are a leader who is neurotypical or at least not identified in any way of neurodivergent, it's really important to just expand your understanding of just the range of what humans are, what humans can be, and what we considered normal and typical. And whenever I say normal, I always put it in the quote because normal doesn't exist.
No.
And the norms and the expectations, and just try to ask, why do we expect people to behave in certain ways? Why do we expect small talk and then subconsciously reward small talk on performance evaluations? So just evaluating a lot of the norms and expectations. But also, I think it would be really, really important for organizations to not just think about individual leadership, but think about leadership teams and creating leadership teams that also bring in a range of strengths, and that means including neurodivergent strengths. Because when we have different types of leaders in the organization, then different types of people can also have someone to connect to and someone who understands them more from the personal experience. So there's two things, at least. Trying for everyone to understand how to work with people that are different from you and different from you in a very deep psychological way. If you're an extrovert, how introverts function. If you need music in the background, try to understand what it's like when person experiences music as pain. That's very difficult sometimes because it's such in a basic way contradicts the experience of life. But really try to listen to people and to believe them. But also for people in the organizations, just create leadership teams where there are people that don't have to make that effort to believe others because they also know what it's like to be different in those ways.
Thank you. I think, what you've said there really resonates with me, to have leadership teams that themselves are diverse and that are open to different perspectives. That curiosity is so important. Those were definitely the teams that were the higher performing leadership teams. And I think we do often think of leadership again as an individual sport, but it's a team activity, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Role modeling that is really important. Many of our listeners might also be coaches. What kind of guidance would you give to somebody who is coaching an organisation to help them with their neuroinclusion? What could coaches do?
Again, there's so many different types of coaching, whether you're working with leaders or if you're doing organizational consulting on the structure level, which is what I do. But the first thing is just to really, whether you work on individual level or on the group level, is to find what the particular individual pain point for this organization. I don't like coming with solutions. I come with questions because each person and each organization are different. So find the pain point that's bothering people right now and address it. And that's really what leaders or coaches or consultants, I think, really, really need to do, rather than, here, I wrote a book about it, I got a solution for you. But what is actual problem in this particular situation? Solutions come with curiosity.
Is that your favorite question, or do you have a favorite question you like to ask when you bring that curiosity?
I usually work on organizational level. So I usually look at surveys and then try to find the pain point that's shared by multiple people. If it's on the individual level, sometimes people don't know, but if you keep digging, what's bothering you and why is that happening? And why is that happening? So, the repeated question method, that's how you get to it, because very often people need to dig for it a little bit.
Yeah, they've kind of accepted it a little bit and internalized it or become institutionalized to it, haven't they?
Yeah.
Fantastic. I've got one last question, Ludmila, and it is, having written the Canary Code, what do you hope its long-term impact to be?
Well, of course, I hope that many leaders and many organizations will read it, as well as people who are neurodivergent, just so they could better understand that they're not alone in their experiences. But hopefully, I distilled it to 6 principles that are pretty general. It could work for any organization. So listening to people and supporting participation and transparency, outcome evaluation. I would really love more organizations to look at their leadership, human resources practices and just see how they compare to those principles. And what I obviously want to see eventually, where I really did it, so I really want to see those unemployment numbers for neurodivergent people to go down and change, because that's what really boils it down to. It's human lives and people being able to exercise their talents and not having those awful unemployment statistics.
Ludmila, I completely agree with you. I'm still so disappointed when I see them. For people listening, what are they currently in terms of people who are not in work?
It's horrible. It's different by different countries. UK is slightly better than the US, and a lot of those numbers are lagging. But we do know that for neurodivergent people in general, it's about 30 to 40%. For autistic people, it depends, but for some highly educated autistic people, there are those numbers, they're 85%. They usually include underemployment, but underemployment can be extremely painful too when you're doing something that's nowhere near your educational level. But even if it's like 78% or something like that, the UK says you are better than the US, or even like good countries like Australia and Germany, like 40% is still not awesome. So we definitely need to do better. So good countries was again like in the quotes, but they're doing better than US and UK.
Well, I know that your book gives many ways that people can understand if they're kind of needing to build their understanding. But if they're at the point of wanting to improve their practice, there's so many examples in there as well. And you've just given everybody a fantastic insight as to the 6 principles and how they can work in practice. So I want to thank you for being on the podcast today and ask, is there anything else that you want to add?
Just the one last piece that I usually finish with is the platinum rule. Just don't treat people how you want to be treated. Treat them how they want to be treated. That's the last one.
I absolutely agree with you. I think that's a brilliant place to leave it today. And thank you so much for being with us, Ludmila. I've really enjoyed talking with you. Thank you.
Thank you for your work. Appreciate you. Appreciate your poetry and what you do with bringing that community together. It's so meaningful to people. Really enjoy seeing what you do in that realm.
Well, thank you for supporting me on that endeavor as well. I really appreciate that.
Wonderful. My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to another podcast by the Association for Coaching. For over 20 years, our purpose has been to inspire and champion coaching excellence, advance the coaching profession, and make a sustainable difference to individuals, organisations and society. To find out more about the AC and our member benefits, follow us on LinkedIn or visit our webpage at associationforcoaching.com, where you can explore our digital learning hub and enjoy our extensive library of on-demand webinars, podcasts, and a portfolio of live events featuring thought leadership tools, models, and the very latest industry trends to help you develop your coaching expertise.